My son gave me an ultimatum. You'll serve my wife or you can get out on the street. I nodded, took my bag and left quietly a week later. But on the day they returned home, a surprise was waiting for them. One they certainly didn't expect. Subscribe to the channel and share your stories in the comments. And now let's get started. Right after the memorial, my son said, "Either serve Emma or get out." That's how my husband's ashes had barely cooled before my own son declared me redundant. His voice carried no tremor of grief, no pause for decency. He didn't even look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed fixed on Emma, as though waiting for her nod of approval. She gave it, a small tilt of her chin, the same way she might approve of a new handbag or a revised Instagram caption. That was the rhythm of my dismissal. My child's ultimatum, his wife's smirk, and silence in the room where I had just buried my partner of 41 years. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I smiled, a small crooked thing that must have looked to them like surrender, and said, "I'll need a week, just to get my affairs in order." Jake leaned back in his chair, exhaling with the relief of a man who believes he has won. Emma tapped her nails against the table in slow, deliberate beats. It sounded like triumph. But the only one who didn't hear defeat in my voice was me. 7 days later, I stepped onto the shoulder of Pine Hollow Road with a canvas bag over my shoulder, and the sharp October air in my lungs. The bag was small, embarrassingly so for a woman who had spent her life building homes, raising a family, stocking cupboards, mending every tear. Inside were only essentials. A change of clothes, a folder of documents, the watch John had given me on our 20th anniversary. But what I carried in my chest was something neither of them expected. An emptiness so profound it felt like the first breath I had taken in years. They were sure I'd break. They were sure the week I'd asked for was to cry myself sick, to cling to the walls of the bakery, to plead for scraps of belonging. What I did instead was sharpen my edges. I didn't cry once. Instead, I moved like a woman in command of a secret rhythm. I signed papers. I called people who still remembered me not as Jake's mom or Emma's extra pair of hands, but as Helen Brooks, the baker who used to rise before dawn so that Willow Creek could smell cinnamon in the streets on Sundays. For decades, I'd been the reliable hum in the background, kneading, carrying, sacrificing. But in that week, I became deliberate. They thought they had squeezed obedience out of me. What they squeezed out was doubt. "Pick the street," my son said. His voice still echoes sometimes, brittle with arrogance. He thought it was an insult, a final dismissal. Pick the street, as though exile was the only future I had left. Fine. Picked one. Pine Hollow Road. Only it won't be me under the open sky, abandoned and broken. That was the mistake he never saw coming. Because that week wasn't a countdown to my disappearance. It was a rehearsal for their reckoning. I remember each day of that quiet week with the clarity of a soldier memorizing the march. Monday. The house still smelled of lilies from John's memorial, and Emma barked at me to fetch coffee for her visiting friends while she held court in my kitchen. I smiled, served, and then, after the guests left, I opened the drawer where John and I kept the old lease papers. My fingers trembled, not from grief but from recognition. The bakery, the heart of everything we built, was not theirs to claim. Not yet. Not ever. Tuesday, I walked to the courthouse. People nodded at me, Helen the baker, the woman who fed their children after football practice. Some tilted their heads in pity, thinking grief had hollowed me. They didn't see the steel in my step as I asked for certified copies stamped and sealed. Wednesday, I called Nathan Lee, our attorney. I told him everything in clipped, measured sentences. His silence on the other end was not pity. It was calculation. "We can work with this, Helen," he said at last. For the first time in months, my chest loosened. Thursday. Emma posted a photo of herself in the bakery kitchen with the caption, "Retrograde aesthetics. Stay tuned for the rebrand." I saved the screenshot *T, forwarded it to Nathan, and began drafting letters. Friday, Patricia, my banker, called back. I asked her to put a temporary freeze on all outgoing accounts. She hesitated. "Helen, are you sure?" "I'm past sure," I said. The silence that followed felt like the first clean breath after years underwater. Saturday, I packed the small bag. I didn't touch John's clothes. I didn't walk into Jake's old room. I folded one sweater, one skirt, one pair of sturdy shoes. I placed the watch John gave me in the pocket, wound tight. I stared at the bare walls, at the house stripped of laughter and respect, and I felt nothing but clarity. Sunday morning. I set the keys on the kitchen table with a short note. Thanks for the lesson. I didn't wait for anyone to wake. I didn't leave a forwarding address. Bag over shoulder, coat pulled tight, I stepped into the chill of Pine Hollow Road. The asphalt stretched before me, indifferent and endless. Cars hissed past, some slowing as neighbors craned their necks, pity etched in their faces. Molly from the market stopped me at the corner. "Helen, are you okay?" she asked softly. "Better than it looks," I said, because I wasn't walking away empty. I was walking away with everything they never imagined I'd claim. My name, my will, my freedom. I can still feel that first breath. It wasn't grief, though John's absence was still raw. It wasn't fear, though I was stepping into an unknown future with nothing but a bag. It was something sharper, cleaner, like oxygen flooding a body that had been suffocating too long. That was my beginning. Not their ultimatum, not their cruelty, not the humiliation of being ordered to serve or leave. My beginning was the moment I stepped onto Pine Hollow Road and realized I had been carrying the keys to my own release all along. My name is Helen Brooks. I am 65 years old and I still knead dough the way John taught me. Pressing with the heel of the hand, folding, turning, pressing again, until the mixture yields like a heartbeat under the skin. John said bread was the truest mirror of a person. It showed patience, strength, and rhythm. "Bread will rise if you rise with it," he'd tell me. His hands dusted white as flour, his dark hair damp with sweat. We opened our bakery in 1985, on the corner of Pine and Fifth. We didn't have investors or glossy business plans. We had 2 ovens, a second-hand mixer John hauled in the back of his pickup, and a recipe book scrawled with notes from my mother and his grandmother. Our sign was painted by a neighbor's teenage son in exchange for free pies for a year. That was the beginning. Rough wood, raw hope, and the kind of exhaustion that felt holy because it was shared. We didn't scale into a chain. We didn't chase franchises or billboards. We raised people. Our shop became a hearth for Willow Creek. At school fairs, we donated trays of rolls. On cold nights, we left baskets of bread outside the shelter door. At Christmas, we baked pies for neighbors who couldn't afford one. John believed a bakery should smell like generosity as much as cinnamon. And people remembered us for that. Jake grew up in the back room, his crib pushed against sacks of flour, his toys scattered among the baking trays. I used to wipe his face with the corner of my apron as he toddled between ovens, already impatient, already restless. He hated the early mornings, hated the long lines, hated the way flour clung to everything we wore. "I'll never work here," he told us when he was 12, slamming the counter after a customer asked him to carry bread to their car. John only smiled, the kind of smile that says we'll see. But Jake was always sure he knew better. He dropped out of college after 1 year, claiming professors were too old-fashioned. He chased one project after another. A landscaping company that collapsed within months, a stint selling supplements that ended with unopened boxes piled in our garage, a startup he launched with friends that never saw daylight. Each failure left him more bitter, more determined to prove he was smarter than his parents who just baked bread. And then came Emma. Emma was everything Jake thought he wanted. Sharp-tongued, camera-ready, forever holding her phone like a sword. She called herself a business guru, on Instagram, posting glossy manifestos about the woman brand and authentic hustle. I never saw her cook a meal or fold laundry, but she could lecture an entire room about monetizing lifestyle. The first time she entered our bakery, she wrinkled her nose at the old wooden shelves. "Vintage is in right now," she said, running a manicured finger across the counter. "But you need consistency, branding, packaging, narrative." John and I exchanged a glance over the ovens. We had never needed branding to keep people coming back. Our branding was the crust on the bread, the smell in the street, the way neighbors lingered at the counter because they felt at home. Still, Jake looked at her as if she had descended with wisdom carved in stone. He followed her voice the way people follow gospel. He stopped talking about learning the business and started talking about restructuring the brand. He called us outdated. He said words like scalability and market positioning. He rolled his eyes at the free loaves we gave to the shelter. I tried to ignore it at first. Children grow up, I told myself. They rebel. They carve their own paths. I thought Emma was a phase, a gust of wind that would pass. But wind can turn into a storm, and storms can level houses built from decades of work. When John got sick, his heart failing piece by piece over 18 months, Jake and Emma came rarely. Their visits were short, distracted. Emma sat in the corner scrolling her phone. Jake paced, muttering about opportunities. John, pale but steady, never complained. "They're busy," he told me, squeezing my hand. "They'll come around." But I knew better. I saw the way Emma's eyes flicked across our house, calculating its value, already imagining what she could do with the space. The morning John passed, Emma was already on her phone drafting a post about life teaching us resilience. Jake's arm around her looked more like a prop than comfort. I stood in the kitchen, numb, watching the woman who had never once lifted a tray of bread in her life prepare to use my husband's death as content. That was the first time I felt the shift. A warning that the family I thought I had raised was no longer mine. After the memorial, when Jake delivered his ultimatum, the past rose in me like a tide. All the mornings I rose before dawn, the years of aching feet, the nights I soothed John's cough with wet cloths. Every loaf, every pie, every quiet act of devotion. And then I looked at the son we had raised. His jaw set in arrogance, his wife's hand curled possessively around his wrist, and I realized they weren't asking for help. They were announcing conquest. To them, I was no longer Helen Brooks, baker, wife, mother. I was an obstacle to clear, a resource to be drained. Emma used the word in passing once, not realizing I heard her. "We just need to manage Helen as a resource." My name, my decades, my sacrifice reduced to the language of management. That was the moment I understood the truth. John and I had built bread and backbone, but our son and his wife were hungry for something else entirely. Not warmth, not memory, not community. They wanted ownership without labor, profit without sacrifice, legacy without loyalty. And standing there in the wreckage of John's life, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would take everything if I let them, but they would never see me coming. It started small. Small enough that if I had wanted to excuse it, I could have. A sharp tone, a dismissive gesture, a laugh that didn't fit the moment. Cruelties that wore the costume of casual remarks. But small things accumulate. A drop is nothing, until the ceiling caves in from a leak no one bothered to patch. The first slap of humiliation came on the day of John's memorial. My kitchen, where I had rolled dough for decades, was full of neighbors bearing casseroles and flowers. I had brewed coffee in the pot John and I used every Sunday morning, the aroma filling the house the way it always had. Emma walked in, heels clacking against the tile, and sniffed at the pot like it held poison. "Helen, we're out of napkins," she snapped, loud enough for half the guests to hear. I opened my mouth to reply, but she wasn't done. "And make real coffee, not this." She slid the pot aside as if it offended her, tossing her hair for effect. "We'll use catering, your food is dated." My face burned while people watched, their eyes skittering away out of politeness. Some chuckled uneasily, others whispered. Nobody defended me. I stood there like the hired help, the widow who couldn't even be trusted to serve a decent cup of coffee. The kitchen where John and I had once danced to an old radio while loaves rose in the oven felt suddenly foreign, hostile, stolen. The next day, humiliation took a sharper edge. Jake pulled me into the bakery, our bakery, and in front of staff he made an announcement. "Folks, moms on mornings, floors and cleanup. We're setting standards." His tone was casual, managerial, the tone of someone promoting efficiency. But everyone knew what it meant. The owner was being demoted to janitor. I looked at the faces of employees who had once treated me like family. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others kept their eyes down, unwilling to risk Jake's wrath. I nodded as if it didn't sting, but inside I felt the lash. Evenings were worse. Emma transformed the dining area into her stage. She hosted investor meetups, dragging in glossy pamphlets and buzzing about monetization potential. She stationed me at the door. "Smile and wave," she instructed, as if I were a mascot for hire. Guests arrived in sleek cars, clutching their portfolios, and I, the woman who had built the place with her hands, was reduced to a greeter, a living prop for Emma's brand of ambition. She laughed loudly when I tried to join their conversations. "Oh, Helen doesn't do numbers," she'd say with a mock sympathetic smile. as if I were an elderly aunt confused by modern life. Then she would pivot, dazzling the crowd with words like synergy and future-proof. I knew those words meant nothing baked, nothing needed, nothing earned. But the humiliation was in the performance, making me invisible in my own bakery. At church, where dignity should have been safe, she struck again. Standing in the pews after service, she raised her voice so it carried. Hope the congregation chips in for Helen's nursing home. The laughter that followed, thin, nervous, guilty, sliced through me. Some faces flushed with shame for her cruelty, but no one spoke. Even pity can sound like agreement when it's silent. I stood rigid, the hymn still vibrating in the rafters, my dignity dragged into the dirt for sport. The pattern was set. Every day some new barb. Emma insisted my recipes were outdated. She replaced my handwritten chalkboard menu with laminated sheets plastered in pastel graphics. She mocked my handwriting, saying it looked like arthritis. Jake joined her chorus, his voice flat and practiced. Times are changing, Mom. Get with it or step aside. Step aside. As if the decades had been nothing. As if John sweat my aching hands, the thousands of loaves baked while Jake played at being visionary elsewhere, were worth less than Emma's hashtags. They didn't just humiliate me in private. They needed an audience. Emma craved it like sugar. At dinner one evening she set her phone on the table, pressed record and grinned. Parents should be useful, she announced. Tonight my mother-in-law is my helper. She filmed me ladling soup, my back bent, while comments rolled in from strangers on her live stream. Comment how your ML serves you, she instructed viewers, eyes gleaming with cruelty disguised as humor. Jake laughed along, his chuckle as empty as the bowls I carried. It was a performance of dominance, a public erasure of my dignity. I felt the weight of every eye, both in the room and in the invisible ether of Emma's followers. Once people looked at me with respect. Now they looked with amusement or pity. And humiliation has a texture. It's not just pain, it's sticky, clinging, impossible to wash off. At night, alone in my bed, I replayed every word, every laugh, every turned away face. My skin crawled with the memory of their tones. I clenched my fists against the sheets, feeling the humiliation settle into my bones. But something else was happening underneath the bruises. With each public cut, with every smirk, every forced smile I gave, a layer of numbness peeled away. What replaced it wasn't despair, it was clarity. I watched them carefully. Their voices, their rehearsed cruelty, the way they thrived on spectacle. They mistook my silence for surrender. They thought I was shrinking. But inside, I was cataloging every humiliation like evidence. Each one a brick in the case they didn't know I was building. They thought the cold showers of humiliation would break me. But cold water can also wake you up. And by the end of that week, I wasn't drowning anymore. I was wide awake. On the third day after John's memorial, I found Jake at my kitchen table with papers spread out like a feast. Not condolence cards. Not family photos. Not letters from old friends who remembered my husband. No, this was a banquet of betrayal, served in neat stacks that smelled of fresh toner. He had set everything just so. Clipped corners, stapled packets, tabs in neon colors. Emma hovered beside him, her phone in hand, capturing the tableau for her records, or maybe for her audience. She looked at me the way an estate agent looks at a house. Appraising, detached, already speaking in numbers. Mom, Jake began in that patronizing voice he had adopted since John's illness, we've got an offer. A condo developer is offering $2. $8 million. They'll tear down the bakery, put in a loft club. It's fair. You'll get a room in assisted living. No more stress for you. No more heavy lifting. He slid the top page toward me, his finger tapping the signature line. My stomach turned when I saw the name written there, John's. My husband's signature, ruler straight, perfect to the point of parody. I knew that line. I had watched him sign receipts for decades, the small loop he made in the J, the way his hand trembled slightly in his last months. This was not that. This was machine perfect, soulless, forged. Emma leaned down, her perfume choking the air. John wanted change, she said smoothly, as if she were the interpreter of the dead. He told Jake so many times. He wanted to modernize, to get with the times. He wouldn't want you breaking yourself over ovens anymore. Her words were honey poured over arsenic. I kept my face still. Inside, something snapped so hard I almost heard it. The paper in front of me wasn't just a business deal. It was erasure. It was them deciding the bakery, the one John and I had built brick by brick, was outdated, expendable, an inconvenience on the path to their shiny vision. It was them deciding my life's work could be traded for lofts and cocktail bars. I didn't touch the papers. I didn't argue. I simply sat, hands folded, and studied my son. His jaw clenched with a salesman's resolve, his eyes darting to Emma for approval. He wasn't grieving his father. He wasn't even looking at me. He was looking past me, toward the numbers, the profit, the empire he thought was finally within reach. "I'll need time," I said quietly. Jake exhaled like I had given in. Emma smiled, a victory smile, and gathered the papers into a neat pile, sliding them back into her leather folder emblazoned with her personal brand logo. They heard consent. I heard a clock start ticking. The kitchen grew unbearably silent after they left. I sat alone, the ghost of John's forged signature burning in my eyes. My husband's name stolen and we *p***nized. My husband's memory, bent to their convenience. I pressed my palms against the table, trying to steady myself, but my hands shook with a fury I hadn't felt in years. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked from room to room, the house dark and heavy with absence. I touched the bread peel hanging on the wall, the one John and I had used since our first day at the bakery. It was worn smooth from years of service, a relic of everything we had built. My fingers brushed the wood, and then, almost by instinct, reached behind it. There, in the little metal box we had hidden decades ago, lay the documents that told a different story. My passport in my maiden name, the original 30-year master lease for the bakery, held not by Brooks & Son, but by Brooks Hearth LLC, a company registered in my name alone, and the deed to the warehouse behind the shop, purchased quietly before John's health declined, with funds I had saved in case the worst happened. I sat on the floor, the metal box open in front of me, and for the first time in weeks I felt steady. Jake and Emma thought they were holding the only cards. They thought they had forged the truth. But I had the originals. I had leverage they couldn't imagine. The smell of toner still lingered in the house, sharp and sterile. Their papers were fresh, manufactured, empty of soul. Mine smelled of dust, of ink faded by years, of the quiet stubbornness of preparation. I realized then that this wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was about survival. Not physical survival, I could live anywhere. It was about the survival of legacy, of truth, of John's name, which I refused to let them drag across cheap paper for profit. I locked the box again, placed it under my arm, and whispered into the silence of the house. "Not yet, John. Not yet. They think I'm broken. They have no idea." The clock ticked on. Their deadline was coming, but so was mine. They decided to stage it as a family dinner. That's what Emma called it, chirping the words with artificial sweetness, her phone already in her hand like a wee *p***n polished for battle. "A cozy night," she said, "to show our audience how we balance business and family." Balance in her mouth meant control. Family in her mouth meant content. The table was set with dishes I had cooked, because of course it was. A pot of soup steaming gently, the smell of herbs filling the kitchen. I had chopped, stirred, tasted, and served in silence. Emma hadn't lifted a finger except to adjust the lighting on her phone. Jake poured himself a glass of wine and leaned back in his chair as if he were a guest, not the son of the woman bending over the stove. When Emma pressed the button, her voice turned bright, performative. "Hey everyone. Welcome back. Tonight we're doing something special. Parents should be useful, right? So tonight my mother-in-law is my helper." Her phone's red light glowed like an accusation. The comments rolled in almost immediately. Little hearts, laughing faces, strangers typing jokes about mother-in-laws and servitude. Emma giggled at everyone, tilting the camera toward me as I ladled soup into bowls. "Look at her go," she chirped. "Comment how your email serves you." I stood there, spoon in hand, my back aching, my face burning. The humiliation wasn't hidden anymore. It was broadcast. My degradation wasn't a private cruelty but public entertainment. Jake laughed along, not the laugh of a son sharing joy, but the laugh of a man affirming his wife's dominance. His eyes flicked toward Emma for approval, as though he needed her permission even to find his own mother amusing. I watched him through the steam rising from the pot, and in that moment he looked like a stranger. A child I had raised who had grown into someone I could no longer recognize. The comments cut sharper than knives. She looks tired, haha. Put her in an apron. That's how you do it, free labor. Emma clapped her hands in mock delight, reading them out loud. See, Helen? People love seeing you help. Help. That's what they called it. Servitude dressed up as charm. I forced a smile, the kind women learn when cornered in public. The kind that keeps the peace while every nerve inside you screams. I ladled the last bowl, set it on the table, and sat down without being asked. Emma's eyes narrowed briefly. She hadn't scripted me sitting. She wanted me on my feet, moving, serving. But she let it slide, busy with her phone. Busy reading comments that fed her hunger. Dinner passed in a blur of clinking cutlery and Emma's voice narrating for her invisible audience. I barely tasted the soup I had cooked. I sat in silence, hands folded in my lap, while they smiled and joked over me like I wasn't there. Afterward, when the camera was off, Jake's face hardened. He waited until I began to clear plates, then delivered it, the line he had been rehearsing all day. Either you listen to Emma, or you're out tomorrow. No performance this time. No smirk for the camera. Just flat, sharp, merciless. I set the plate down gently, the porcelain ringing against the table. My voice came out calm, too calm. I'll leave in a week. Jake blinked, startled by my composure. Emma smirked, her lips curling in triumph. Don't forget to leave the kitchen keys, she said, as if the kitchen were hers to command. Of course, I replied. And that was that. They thought the curtain had fallen, that the act was complete, that I was walking into exile. They didn't see the steel in my calm. They didn't hear the gears turning behind my silence. That night, when the house was quiet, I went to the bakery one last time. The ovens were dark, the counters bare. I walked past the racks, past the shelves where loaves once cooled in neat rows. My hand brushed the old bread peel mounted on the wall, a relic of our first years, worn smooth by John's grip and mine. I reached behind it, my fingers finding the edge of the small metal box we had hidden there decades ago. I carried it to the back office and set it on the desk. My hand shook as I opened it, but not from fear. From recognition. From the weight of what I had protected without even knowing why. Inside were the artifacts of survival, my passport in my maiden name, the 30-year master lease for the bakery under Brooks Hearth LLC, and the deed to the corner warehouse John and I had purchased quietly before his health declined. Proof that the bakery wasn't theirs to dismantle, proof that the ovens and water lines ran to a property I controlled, proof that the legacy of our work was not a pawn in their game. I traced my finger over the embossed seal of the deed. John's voice echoed in my memory. Bread will rise if you rise with it. For the first time since his death, I felt him with me. Not in grief but in resolve. Emma had called me her helper. Jake had threatened me with exile. They thought humiliation would break me. Instead, it had stripped away my last illusions. I closed the metal box, tucked it under my arm, and whispered into the empty bakery. The maid you invented is dead. Helen remains. That was the night the game changed. The box was small. Ironically small for what it contained. A battered metal case, once used to hold John's spare screws and washers, tucked behind the bread peel like an afterthought. To Emma it would have looked like junk. To Jake it would have been invisible, like so many of the things I carried silently for decades. But inside that box lay the difference between being erased and standing my ground. I spread the contents out on the desk beneath the weak glow of the office lamp. My passport in my maiden name, edges frayed. The photo of a young woman with a wide, unlined face staring back at me. Brooks Hearth LLC registration papers, my name typed firmly on the line. A company I had formed all those years ago when John and I decided one of us should hold the lease in separate hands. Just in case. He thought it a matter of pragmatism. I thought it unnecessary at the time. Now it looked prophetic. The 30-year master lease for the bakery. Signed, sealed, notarized. Not in Brooks & Son. The name Jake had plastered across Instagram bios and pitch decks, but in Brooks Hearth. My company. The bakery was not theirs to rebrand, demolish, or monetize. It was mine to protect or to shut down. And the deed to the corner warehouse. Purchased before John's health began to fail, with funds I had scraped together from savings and careful deals. A plain building, brick and unadorned, but with space enough for ovens, storage, and staff. More than that, it housed the utility hookups, the water lines, the gas, the electrical grid. Without that warehouse, the bakery was an empty shell. Without me, they had nothing. I sat back in the chair. The papers spread before me like we*p*ns. For days they had humiliated me, stripped me down, called me a maid, a relic, a burden. They thought they had cornered me with documents printed on glossy letterhead, and a forged signature of my dead husband. They thought they had me pressed against the wall, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But they hadn't accounted for the quiet corners of memory. They hadn't accounted for my caution, my foresight, my refusal to let my husband's work die with him. I pressed my palm against the cool paper of the lease, steadying myself. John's voice rose in my mind, not in words but in rhythm. The rhythm of kneading, folding, turning, pressing. The rhythm of resilience. That night I made 3 calls. The first was to Nathan Lee, our attorney. A man who had eaten my bread for 30 years, who had walked his children into our shop on Saturdays for muffins, who had seen John and me as constants in the town. When I explained the situation, his voice grew taut, clipped but calm. We'll move quickly. I'll prepare filings. We'll notify the developer that any agreement is invalid, without the tenant's consent. And the tenant is you, Helen. The second call was to Patricia Woods, the banker who had handled our accounts for decades. I asked her to freeze the bakery's operating account. She hesitated only a moment before replying. If suspicious charges have been made, I can lock it pending review. Suspicious didn't begin to cover it. I knew Emma had been siphoning funds for her branding projects. But now the flow would stop. The third was to Becca Rivers, editor of the Willow Creek Chronicle, a woman who loved stories of the town, who remembered when John and I first opened our doors. Becca, I said, my voice low, steady, I have something for you. Not gossip. A story. About how a family legacy is being gutted for profit. She didn't ask for proof. She trusted my word. Bring me what you have, she said. I hung up the phone and felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not grief, but the faint pulse of an engine starting after years of silence. The next morning I packed the ledgers, the handwritten books of recipes, the lineage of our bakery. Every loaf John and I had ever made began in those pages. I lifted the jar of mother yeast, alive and bubbling, the soul of our bread, and wrapped it in cloth. I gathered the cast iron pans, the wooden baking forms, the trays scarred with decades of use. These were not props for Emma's branding. They were the heart of the bakery. I carried them into the corner warehouse, unlocking the door with a key they didn't know existed. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold brick. Empty shelves lined the walls, waiting. I set down the ledgers, the yeast, the pans, and felt the space transform. Not just a warehouse but a sanctuary. A seed of rebirth. For years I had given them everything: time, money, loyalty, silence. They had mistaken it for weakness. They had mistaken my stillness for surrender. But bread rises in silence too. Slowly, invisibly, until the heat comes. That night, Emma posted a photo online. Her standing in the bakery's dining area, arms spread, captioned "Exciting remodel coming soon. Stay tuned for the future of Willow Creek dining." The comments poured in with emojis and applause. I saved the screenshot *T and slipped it into my growing file. Every humiliation, every slip, every lie, they were all fuel now. In the days that followed, my phone didn't stop buzzing. Nathan drafting injunctions. Patricia confirming the freeze. Becca asking for quotes, for documents, for context. I answered each call calmly, deliberately, while Jake and Emma paraded in the front room of the bakery, convinced they were in control. They called me a maid. They staged me as content. They signed my husband's name without a tremor of shame. And all the while the box sat on my desk, quiet, unassuming, ordinary. They would never have looked for it. They would never have believed that the woman they mocked, the widow they dismissed, had been carrying the one card they could never outplay. The box changed everything. The box reminded me I wasn't powerless. I had only been patient. And patience, when it turns, is the sharpest blade of all. They believed I was packing boxes, folding clothes, preparing to disappear. They thought my quiet week meant tears, regret, the slow emptying of drawers and cupboards before I shuffled into the shadows. But my quiet was not silence. It was movement. It was signatures, filings, meetings. My quiet was the low hum of an engine they could not hear because they were too busy listening to their own applause. Monday. At dawn I met Nathan in his office. He wore his fatigue like a badge, his tie crooked, his hair streaked with gray. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose as he flipped through the master lease. His lips tightened. "This is airtight," he said. "Jake and Emma can't sell or repurpose anything without your consent. If they try, we'll seek an injunction." We drafted the first letter that morning, addressed to Silver Aspen Developments. Clear, legal, absolute. The deal was impossible without the tenant's agreement. And the tenant was Brooks Hearth LLC. My name. My company. Nathan leaned back in his chair, eyes tired but sharp. "You understand, Helen, this isn't just defense. This is offense. You're cutting them off at the knees before they even get to the table." I nodded. My fingers traced the edge of the lease steady. "They thought they buried me," I said. "They don't realize I'm the ground they're standing on." Tuesday. Patricia Woods met me at the bank. Her office smelled faintly of leather and ink, the air-conditioned chill a contrast to the storm I carried inside. She scrolled through transactions with a frown. Influencer marketing charges. Designer catering deposits. Luxury decor rentals. She listed, her voice clipped. "Helen, this isn't business spending. This is siphoning." She tapped the keyboard, then looked at me. "Do you want me to freeze the account?" "Yes," I said simply. Her fingers flew. The sound of keystrokes felt like G** fire in a war I had not chosen but could no longer avoid. "Done," she said. "They won't like it." "They don't have to like it," I replied. "They just have to live with it." Wednesday. I carried a folder to the Heritage Board. Inside were photographs, receipts, news clippings. John had saved everything. Flyers from the bakery's opening. Letters from the mayor thanking us for donations. Photos of school fairs where our bread stood stacked in pyramids. At the time I teased him for hoarding. Now I carried his foresight like a wee *p***n. The board members, a half-dozen men and women in modest suits, leafed through the evidence. One man adjusted his tie nervously. "If the bakery qualifies for historic designation," he said, "demolition or repurposing becomes almost impossible without approval." "It qualifies," I said, my voice flat. "This isn't just a shop. It's part of the town's memory." They nodded, murmuring. I walked out of the chamber with my back straight, John's file pressed to my chest like a shield. Thursday. In the warehouse I unpacked the ledgers. Their leather spines creaked as I set them on a shelf. The air was cool, musty, but alive with possibility. I unwrapped the jar of mother yeast and placed it carefully on a counter near the window where sunlight would warm it. It bubbled faintly, as though recognizing it had been moved to a new home. I carried in the cast iron pans, their surfaces dark with decades of seasoning. The baking forms, the scarred trays. Piece by piece, the bones of the bakery crossed the threshold into sanctuary. I locked the door behind me, slipped the key into my pocket, and felt the weight of ownership settle into me. Not as burden but as armor. Friday. I sat with Becca at the Chronicle office. Her desk was a chaos of notepads, sticky notes, and coffee mugs. She pushed her hair behind her ear as she scribbled, her eyes sharp. "So they're calling you outdated. They're telling investors you're in the way. And meanwhile, they're draining accounts and forging signatures." She looked up. "Helen, this isn't just a story. This is a reckoning." She showed me a draft headline. "Bread or bars? The battle for Willow Creek's hearth." I almost laughed, the irony so sharp it stung. "Make sure you spell Emma's name right," I said, my voice colder than I intended. Saturday. The phone rang non-stop. Calls from Nathan updating me on filings. Patricia confirming the freeze was holding. Becca requesting quotes. Each ring was a drumbeat, steady, relentless. Meanwhile, Jake and Emma staged their little empire. They threw investor meetups in the bakery dining area, pitching visions of lofts and luxury. Emma strutted in tailored suits, her phone forever recording. Jake parroted phrases he barely understood. Equity share. Franchise potential. Market disruption. They didn't notice the ovens were gone. Didn't notice the yeast was missing. Didn't notice the recipe ledgers had vanished. They were too busy talking about a future built on air. I walked past the bakery that evening, unseen in the crowd of their guests. Through the window, I watched Emma gesture dramatically while Jake nodded beside her. Their audience sipped wine, smiling, buying into the performance. I stood in the shadows, calm, almost serene. They were staging a show on a hollow stage. Sunday. I sat at my kitchen table, the metal box beside me, the papers spread once more. The house was quiet, but not with grief this time. With resolve. My hands didn't shake anymore. 7 days. That's all it had taken. 7 days of signatures, meetings, quiet transfers of power. 7 days to shift the ground beneath their feet. When I finally stepped out the door that morning with my small bag, it wasn't the bag that mattered. It wasn't the keys I would leave on the table. It was the silence inside me. A silence that wasn't submission. A silence that was the calm before noise. Because now the noise would not come from me. It would come from the collapse of the empire they thought they had built. And I would be there to watch it fall. The 8th morning arrived sharp and clear, the kind of autumn morning that smells of frost and wood smoke, the kind of morning John used to say was honest weather. No disguise, no softness. Just air that cuts clean and makes you breathe deeper whether you want to or not. I stood in the kitchen with my small bag at my feet. The note was already written, folded neatly, resting beside the keys. Thanks for the lesson. That was all I left them. Not anger. Not pleas. Just the truth, clipped and final. The house felt stripped bare, though nothing had been packed away. Grief had left its fingerprints on every corner. John's chair by the window, the sweater draped across the armrest, the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hall. I touched none of it. I had said my goodbyes in silence night after night, as I prepared for this morning. I picked up the bag, adjusted the strap across my shoulder, and stepped outside. The door closed behind me with a click so soft it might have been mistaken for nothing at all. But to me it was thunder. On Pine Hollow Road, the air was crisp enough to sting my lungs. My breath rose in small clouds, white against the gray. Cars passed occasionally, neighbors heading to work or church. Some slowed, eyes flicking toward me with pity or curiosity. They thought they were watching exile. They didn't know they were witnessing rebirth. Molly, the grocer's wife, spotted me as she loaded boxes into her truck. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over. "Helen, are you all right?" "Better than it looks," I said and smiled. Her eyes softened, but she didn't press. Perhaps she saw something in my face that told her questions weren't needed. I walked toward town with steady steps, each one loosening the last tether to the house that had become a stage for my humiliation. Above Mrs. Cho's flower shop a room waited, month to month, simple, unadorned mine. Freedom rarely looks grand from the outside. Often it looks like a rented room with thin curtains, and a key that turns smoothly because no one else has touched it. By noon I was settled there, the bag unpacked into a dresser that smelled faintly of lilies. I sat by the window looking down at the street where people bustled with errands, and felt lighter than I had in years. Then the first messages arrived. Emma, ever the queen of cruelty, sent a photo of my old apron hanging on a hook in the bakery kitchen. The caption, "Retrograde," one word sharpened like a blade. She thought it would wound, that I'd see myself reduced to a relic. I looked at the screen, then deleted the photo without reply. Relics endure. Trends rot. At 3 o'clock, Jake gathered the staff in the bakery floor. He announced, with Emma filming from her perfect angle, "Bakery's closed for a month, remodel coming." I wasn't there, but word traveled fast in Willow Creek. Within an hour, a neighbor had called to whisper the news in a voice thick with concern. I thanked her and said only, "Let them remodel the air." Because at that very hour, Patricia's email landed in Jake's inbox. I knew because she forwarded me the copy. All transactions suspended. Documentation required. Possible fraud investigation pending. A single paragraph that dropped into their day like a stone into glass. By evening, the silence around me was pierced by noise, footsteps, voices raised in panic, phones ringing without pause. Not at my door but at theirs. The bakery's staff, confused and angry, demanded answers. Investors began calling, asking about injunctions and frozen accounts. Emma's social media post announcing the remodel was met not with applause, but with a comment from the Chronicles page. Story developing. Stay tuned. I sat in my rented room above the flower shop, sipping tea that Mrs. Cho had brewed for me, and listened to the faint hum of town life. Below, a couple argued gently about roses. Across the street, children shouted as they chased a ball. In my pocket, my phone vibrated endlessly. Messages from numbers I didn't recognize, calls I had no interest in answering. Jake had told me once, with that smirk that felt like betrayal pressed into flesh. "Pick the street, Mom. You'll be out there before long." And here I was on the street. But not broken. Not begging. Not lost. I thought of John, of his steady hands kneading dough, of his voice saying bread rises if you rise with it. I thought of the years I had given, the decades I had poured into family and flour alike. And I thought of the cold certainty in Jake's ultimatum: serve or leave. I had left. And in leaving, I had taken everything they thought was theirs. That night, lying in a narrow bed under a plain quilt, I felt a strange peace. The first in years. Freedom doesn't roar. It doesn't always come with trumpets or banners. Sometimes it comes quietly, like the click of a door closing behind you, like the hum of a town unaware that history is shifting under its feet. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd silenced me, banished me, stripped me down to nothing. But departure was not defeat. Departure was strategy. And soon they would learn that when you drive someone to the street, you risk finding them standing taller than you imagined, with the whole world watching. The phone rang just after dusk, while the sky still held a faint bruise of color above Willow Creek. I was in Mrs. Cho's flower shop, helping her stack chrysanthemums for the weekend market. The scent of earth and petals filled the air, grounding me. When my phone buzzed, I almost ignored it. Another number I didn't know. But the way it vibrated, insistent, sharp, told me this call mattered. "Miss Brooks," the voice barked when I answered. Mail clipped, impatient. "This is Silver Aspen Developments. We need to know why you are blocking the project." I put the call on speaker and set the phone on the counter. Around me, the quiet became heavy, charged. I had prepared for this. Nathan was already on the line from his office, Patricia patched in from the bank, and Becca, notebook in hand, was ready to record every word. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. I drew a breath and said calmly, "Because what you are calling a project is my life's work. And because the documents you were handed are worthless without me." A pause crackled through the line. Then the developer sneered. "We have signed agreements. Your son and daughter-in-law assured us everything was under control." Nathan's voice cut in, dry as stone. "Signed by a dead man's forged hand. Any court will shred those papers in seconds. The tenant on record is Brooks Hearth LLC. That's Helen Brooks. You are speaking to her now." I could almost hear the man shift in his chair. "This is obstruction. This is ownership," Nathan corrected. Patricia spoke next, her voice cool, precise. "And you should know the bakery's accounts are frozen pending investigation. Suspicious charges tied to influencer marketing. If your investors want transparency, you'll need to explain how money was siphoned into private branding projects before a single condo brick was laid." The developer's breath hissed over the line. "You can't expect this to end well for you." "No," I said evenly. "But I can expect it to end truthfully. 23 years remain on the sublease, with a hard clause that prevents repurposing. The bakery's production, its yeast, its ledgers, its ovens, has already been relocated. And the Heritage Board has received my petition to designate the property historic. Without water service and ovens, your project is an empty shell. Without consent, it's nothing but paper." The silence stretched. For a moment I imagined his face reddening, his jaw tightening. Becca's pen scratched rapidly on her pad. "We'll sue," he said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "We'll see you there," Nathan replied. His voice was almost bored. "But by the time you file, the Chronicle will have printed the story. Your investors will read it over their morning coffee." That was the K*LL. Because money hates noise. Investors flee from scandal faster than rats from fire. The call ended abruptly, a click loud in the small shop. I stared at the phone, my reflection faint in the black screen. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the rush of standing tall for the first time in years. Becca looked up from her notes, her eyes fierce. "This isn't just a local piece anymore," she said. "This is a story about legacy. About a town's heart versus greed." I nodded. My throat felt tight. "Make sure it's written that way," I whispered. Later that night, in my rented room above the flower shop. I sat at the window with the phone in my lap. The street below was quiet, but my mind buzzed with echoes. I thought about the way Jake had sneered at me days before. Serve Emma or get out. I thought about Emma's triumphant smirk as she live-streamed me like a servant. And now, I thought about the sharp edge of panic in a developer's voice when confronted with the truth. They had wanted me erased. But I was not gone. I was louder in silence than they had ever been in spectacle. Around midnight, a message came from Patricia. She had pulled the latest activity on the bakery account. The charges told their own story. Deposits to luxury caterers, rental fees for designer lighting, payments to Emma's so-called branding consultants. Tens of thousands spent without consent, each transaction a nail in their coffin. Patricia's email ended with a single line. Fraud will not stand. I closed my eyes, exhaustion settling into my bones. But beneath it ran a current of something harder, brighter. Resolve. They thought they'd stage a remodel. They thought they'd charm investors and silence me with forged ink. But the truth was simple. You cannot steal from someone who has already stepped away, carrying the soul of the work in her own hands. The bakery they claimed was empty. Empty racks. Empty ovens. Empty accounts. What remained with me was living. The yeast, the recipes, the memory of John's steady hands. And in the dark of that night, for the first time since his death, I felt not only grief but triumph. Because his work, our work, would not be turned into a loft club for strangers. It would breathe again on my terms. The call had sounded different because it wasn't another ultimatum. Another humiliation. It was the sound of the other side realizing they were no longer in control. And it was only the beginning. A week after John's memorial, after their ultimatums and live-streamed humiliations, after the forged signatures and their smug declarations of victory, Jake and Emma returned from their so-called negotiations. They came like royalty returning from campaign, confident the town would kneel. I wasn't there to greet them. I was in my rented room above Mrs. Cho's flower shop, sipping tea with the window open, the autumn air sharp against my skin. But the story traveled fast through Willow Creek, carried on the tongues of neighbors, staff, even passers-by who stopped to watch. They arrived in sleek black cars, Emma stepping out first in a tailored coat the color of bone, Jake behind her with a portfolio under his arm. Their expressions were smug. Their steps rehearsed for the cameras Emma held ready. They opened the bakery doors as though they were about to step onto a stage built for their coronation. But what they walked into was not a kingdom. It was a carcass. The racks were bare. The ovens gone. The smell of yeast and cinnamon that had clung to the air for decades was absent, replaced by the stale scent of dust. Even the sign above the counter Brooks & Son was missing, its hooks empty on the wall. And on the window, taped neatly at eye level, 3 notices fluttered in the draft. The first stamped with legal weight. Lease terminated by Brooks Hearth LLC for cause. The second printed with the county's seal. Property under historic review. No alterations permitted pending decision. The third colder than all the rest. All debts, accounts, and tax matters referred to county auditors. Outside, the staff gathered in a loose semicircle. Men and women who had worked beside me for years, who had felt the shift in air when Jake began barking orders and Emma posted them like props. They stood now with folded arms, their faces set, their pockets heavy with sealed envelopes. Each envelope carried the same letter. Their jobs preserved at the new production site in the corner warehouse, effective immediately. Signed by me, not Jake. Not Emma. Me. I was told later that Emma's face blanched, her jaw tightening as she read the notices. That Jake's hand shook as he tried to pull one down, only to have a staff member step forward and block him, letter in hand. "This isn't yours anymore," the young man said. His voice was steady, even respectful. But the weight of it struck harder than any shout. Someone in the crowd laughed. Not cruelly, but in disbelief. Years of arrogance had unraveled in a single morning, and the town was watching. Because Willow Creek had always watched the bakery. It was more than a shop, it was a pulse. People stopped in for bread, but they also stopped for conversation, for memory, for a sense of belonging. And now they were watching as the so-called new owners discovered that they had inherited only walls. The Chronicle sent a photographer. By evening, the front page would show Jake and Emma standing stiff in the empty bakery, framed by the fluttering notices, the reflection of their own panic caught in the glass. The headline was already drafted. Legacy or loot? Town bakery at center of legal storm. I imagined Emma's hand tightening on Jake's arm, nails pressing through fabric. I imagined Jake's face, pale, the confidence drained, the weight of failure settling in. And I imagined the silence between them, a silence louder than any argument, when they realized the empire they thought they had conquered was already ashes. I didn't need to be there. My absence was louder than my presence could ever have been. From my window, I watched the town move around me. People bought flowers, children tugged at their parents' hands, a couple argued good-naturedly about chrysanthemums. Life went on steady-rooted, unmoved by Jake and Emma's spectacle. And in that quiet, I felt John beside me. Not in grief this time, but in triumph. He had taught me that bread was patient, that it rose unseen until the heat made it bloom. This moment was the bloom. The kings had come home. But the kingdom had moved without them. The bakery smelled of cinnamon. Not the warm kind that clings to rising bread, but the ghost of it, faint and hollow, trapped in the wood of the walls. It was like hearing a familiar song muffled through a closed door. Recognizable but unreachable. I walked in slowly, my steps echoing. The racks were gone, the ovens removed, the counters bare. Only the emptiness remained, echoing louder than any crowd. Jake sat at one of the few chairs left, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. His face was pale, but his jaw still carried that stubborn set, the one he had worn since boyhood whenever he was caught in a lie. Emma stood by the door, her phone raised, recording as if this too was content. Her posture was rigid, her coat too crisp for the dust of the room. Her eyes glittered, but it wasn't confidence, it was calculation. UK asterisk let our deal, Jake said. His voice cracked slightly, but he straightened as if volume could disguise weakness. I set a folder on the table in front of him and slid it across the wood. The sound was sharp, deliberate. I saved a dozen jobs. I saved the town's memory. And I saved your father's name from being forged into a circus. He didn't look at the folder, not yet. His eyes flicked to Emma, who gave the slightest shake of her head. Still, his hand hovered near the papers, trembling just enough to betray him. Inside that folder were two things. The first, their own ultimatum, typed and signed, dated the night they told me to serve Emma or get out. The second, the transcript of Emma's livestream, complete with timestamps, comments, and her words preserved in black and white. Parents should be useful. Tonight my mother-in-law is my helper. Evidence of coercion. Evidence of humiliation. Evidence sharp enough to cut through any lie. You think anyone cares about this? Emma scoffed, her voice bright, brittle. So what, you ladled soup on camera. Everyone thought it was cute. I turned my gaze on her, steady and unblinking. Coercion isn't cute. Humiliation isn't branding. And fraud isn't a trend. You staged a performance, Emma. And now I will stage mine in court. Jake's face darkened. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning, his lips tightening with every line. His hand shook as he turned the pages. Emma shifted, her phone lowering slightly, for the first time forgetting the audience she always imagined behind her lens. Here's how this works, I said, my voice calm. The way one speaks when reading a recipe you know by heart. You sign a full waiver of any claims to the bakery, the warehouse, and all associated assets. You walk away clean. If you don't, these documents go to the county DA tomorrow as a case of fraud, financial abuse, and forced labor. Jake flinched. Emma finally lowered her phone completely. The silence between us stretched, heavy with the sound of their collapsing confidence. You wouldn't, Jake whispered. I leaned forward, my palms flat on the table. I would. And I will. Because you already taught me what lines you're willing to cross. You taught me that family doesn't stop you from signing your father's name after his death. That love doesn't stop you from turning a widow into a maid for strangers online. That blood doesn't stop you from demanding obedience in exchange for shelter. Why would you expect me to protect you now? Emma's voice cracked for the first time. You'll destroy your own son. No, I said, standing tall. You did that. You destroyed the boy I raised the day you turned him against his own home. All I'm doing now is saving what's left. Jake looked down at the folder again. His shoulders sagged. The fight in him wasn't gone, but it had lost its teeth. He reached for the pen I placed beside the papers. His hand shook as he signed page after page, his name scrawled across the waivers. Emma stared at him, her mouth tight, her silence louder than any protest. When the last signature was done, I picked up the folder and slid it into my bag. The weight felt lighter than it should have. Final but not heavy. Jake lifted his eyes to mine, searching for something. Mercy maybe, or the mother he remembered before greed replaced gratitude. But I held his gaze with clarity he couldn't look away from. "You taught me something," I said softly. "That love without respect is slavery. That silence is permission. And that even patience runs out." He opened his mouth but no words came. Emma turned away, her coat swirling as she stormed out into the street. Jake followed a moment later, his steps slow, his shoulders bent, his eyes on the floor. The door swung shut behind them, the empty bakery swallowing the sound. For a long moment I stood alone in that hollow room, the ghost of cinnamon still lingering. I ran my hand along the bare counter where thousands of loaves had cooled, where John and I had once leaned against each other in quiet triumph after long nights. It no longer hurt to stand there. The emptiness was not loss, it was preparation. A room stripped down to its bones, waiting to be rebuilt on stronger terms. I whispered into the silence, not for Jake, not for Emma, but for John. "It's done." And for the first time since the day he died, I felt not just grief but peace. They signed. And then they drove away, not together, but side by side in silence, two figures trapped in the same car yet already drifting apart. I stood at the window of my rented room above the flower shop and watched them go. Their taillights flared once, briefly, before the car disappeared into the dark. No one followed them. No one cheered. Their departure was as empty as the promises they had made. The town did not mourn their loss. It hardly noticed. Silver Aspen pulled its brass plaque from the corner office within days. Its glossy brochures tossed in the trash like yesterday's news. Investors stopped returning their calls. Emma's social media accounts went quiet. No new slogans, no triumphant photo shoots, no live-stream dinners. The silence of someone who built a throne from borrowed bricks and found it collapsing beneath her. 3 months later, the warehouse opened its doors as hearth on the corner. The name gleamed on a modest brass plate, John's name engraved beneath it, in memory of a man who believed bread should feed more than hunger. The ovens roared back to life. The smell of rye and cinnamon spilled into the streets. On Saturdays, children pressed their noses against the glass, just as they had 30 years ago, watching loaves rise in neat golden rows. The town came back to me not with pity but with pride. The Heritage Board granted historic status, saving the old bakery site from demolition. Instead of lofts and cocktail bars, it stood preserved, a shell of memory but safe, untouchable. The new bakery thrummed with life. We ran workshops for schoolchildren, teaching them to knead dough with small, sticky hands. We started a scholarship for young bakers, seeded with donations from neighbors who wanted the town's heart to keep beating. Sometimes I caught myself looking at the crowd, at the families laughing as they carried warm loaves, and I thought, John, we did it. They tried to turn us into dust, but we became stone instead. Jake's name surfaced only rarely, whispered by people who had once spoken it with respect. A neighbor mentioned seeing him working in a distant city, looking thinner, older, angrier. Emma was said to have tried new ventures, coaching, branding, consulting, but each failed more quickly than the last. I didn't check. I didn't follow. Their lives were theirs to lose. Mine was mine to reclaim. Once in a while, a message appeared from an unknown number. "Mom, can we talk?" The first time my hand hovered over the screen. A part of me still carried the reflex of motherhood, the instinct to answer, to soothe, to forgive. But then I remembered the soup ladle in my hand while Emma live-streamed my humiliation. I remembered Jake's voice, sharp as a knife. "Serve Emma or get out." I deleted the messages without replying. Silence is its own kind of justice. I did not revenge, I baked. I did not scheme, I rose the way dough rises in warmth and time. Revenge is loud. It burns quickly, leaving only ashes. Bread is quiet. It nourishes, it endures. People sometimes asked if I hated them. I told the truth, no. Hatred is another chain, binding you to the very thing you want to escape. What I felt was colder than hate. Indifference. A severing. They had chosen greed over loyalty, spectacle over love. I had chosen to walk away, and in walking away I found myself again. On Pine Hollow Road, the day I stepped out with nothing but a small bag, I thought I had lost everything. But what I had really lost was illusion. And what I gained was mine. My name, my freedom, my quiet. Evenings now are simple. I sit by the window of the warehouse office, the ovens humming behind me, and watch the town settle into night. Sometimes the stars burn bright over Willow Creek, and I think of John, his hands dusted with flour, his laughter echoing in the small shop we built from nothing. The grief is still there, but it no longer drowns me. It steadies me. The maid they invented died. Helen remained. And the surprise, the one they never expected, was simple. I always had a choice. I finally used it. So now I leave the question with you, the one that lingers every night as I lock the doors and walk out into the quiet street. When blood turns against you, when loyalty is mocked, when love is nized into servitude, do you kneel or do you rise? Because in the end, silence is not obedience. Sometimes silence is just the pause before the roar of freedom.